Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 10, The Other Side of the Gate. Shortly after his 12th birthday, Daniel was persuaded by his foster father to try out for the Pop Warner football team, one of the man's worst ideas ever. Daniel quit an hour into the first practice, immediately after going through the gauntlet. He could see it was a bad situation right from the start. He was supposed to run a straight line between two rows of bigger boys who all got to cream him with big pads. When the coach blew the whistle, Daniel stood up and asked, "Why would I do a thing like that?" But the coach, a big red screaming face, quickly convinced Daniel that he did indeed want to participate in the self-torturing drill. His teammates came through and did their part. They whacked him silly. The incident is noteworthy now because it was probably the only physical exercise that in any way prepared him for the trip he was about to take, the much rougher ride through the Stargate. As soon as his eyes touched the bright surface of the threshold, he saw the silo wall speeding toward him like a falling house. Much too fast for him to react. By the time he flinched, he was well out of the Earth's atmosphere, accelerating through pitch silent black twisting out of control, smashing blind through speeding interstellar darkness. He felt himself glide for a second until a wrinkle in the energy field threw him end over end. No gravity, no control, no sense of up or down, only the sudden bruising glances off what felt like the walls of a tunnel. Shooting past a cluster of what appeared to be new stars, there was a long flash of light, enough time to see his legs elongated, stretched miles out in front of him, until they snagged, and his head came whipping past as he sailed toward a face-first collision with a gigantic planet. His scream wouldn't sound. He hit the surface and zoomed out the other side, crashing again into the electric burn of the walls, spinning through a vacuum of light and sound, then arriving. Daniel came through in pieces. The toe of his right boot came first, then his left hand materialized. The tip of his nose spread out to become his still wincing face. For a split second, the pieces dangled in the light at the bottom edge of the Stargate, until more molecules came to fill the gaps. When Daniel was whole once more, the ring spat him out onto the hard floor like unwanted luggage, covered in frost. Later, he surmised that the frost was a byproduct of his molecular reconstruction. Just as microwaves can heat objects by increasing the rate of molecular movement, the Stargate chilled its cargo by packing the molecules tightly at the moment of reconstitution. For less than 1/100th of a second, the atoms of Daniel's body were squeezed together at a rate of zero movement, long enough for him to be coated in a thin layer of ice. Freezing and completely disoriented, he was unable to control his fall. He fell out of the ring and hit the floor hard, but not as hard as he would have if he'd gone through first. The entire team lay in a pile on the stairs at the base of the Stargate, spilling off the top of the equipment cart. It was several seconds before the first of them, Kowalski the ox, was able to shake off the dizziness and sit up. When he could focus again, he glanced around the room at what looked like a massacre. Right next to him, curled up like an icy newborn, was Daniel, a pond of vomit near his head. When Daniel found he couldn't breathe, his first impulse was to claw his way back into the beam and get back to Earth's oxygen before he suffocated. That's when he felt a pair of powerful hands close around his arms. Panicked, he tried to fight back. "Jackson, you all right?" It was Kowalski, hoisting Daniel up into a sitting position and then pulling his arms above his head. He started breathing again. When the first cool breath of the new atmosphere hit his lungs, the sting opened his eyes, and he began to cough. The passage through the ring had knocked the wind out of him. When Kowalski was satisfied that Daniel was okay, he went to check the next soldier. The chill from the frost deepened into Daniel's skin. He shuddered and felt like needles were stabbing him everywhere. Remembering who and where he was, he squinted away from the bright light pouring out of this second Stargate, nearly identical to the first, and saw the luminous outlines of the others, scattered around him in various states of recovery. The trip through hadn't been what he'd expected. Not that he assumed it would be some rhapsodic beam-me-up Scotty experience, but neither had he expected to have the crap beat out of him. "Everyone all right?" The soldiers, dazed, disoriented, grumbled in the affirmative until the group's wiseacre, Lieutenant Ferretti, joked sarcastically, "That was a rush. Let's do that again." It was painful to laugh. One by one they sat up, or if they could, got to their feet, still coughing and shivering from the cold. They gathered at the equipment cart as O'Neill started issuing instructions. The inner ring of the Stargate began to spin, then suddenly it stopped with a click, shutting itself off and plunging the room into absolute darkness. O'Neill's voice cut through the darkness. "All right, ladies, let's get to work. Phase 1, just the essentials." With a sharp crack, O'Neill cracked open a flare that sputtered to life, hissing an orange-white light into the room. With choreographed precision, the team began to offload only the equipment they needed for their first reconnaissance expedition. Kowalski broke open a second flare and held it aloft. Daniel watched as Freeman expertly assembled a specially built video camera, and Brown mounted a miniature radar dish to the top of a backpack-size unit for the collection of technical data. While the soldiers continued to prepare, Daniel waded beyond the murky pool of light to the nearest wall in search of clues. The room was a tall black marble box. Daniel inched forward until he found the wall, then ran his hands over the polished surface. Although the large stones were beautifully cut and set, there was no trace of writing anywhere. Daniel moved deeper into the shadows, reading the empty walls by braille. The team was strapping into their equipment, ready to roll. Ferretti, Porro, and Riley switched on powerful flashlights, the beams intersecting in the dark air as they scanned the room. The men gathered at the large doorway, the only way into or out of the room. O'Neill thrust his flare around the corner, peering into the next room. It was a short stone hallway. Everything seemed clear, so he gave Freeman the sign to switch on the intense light at the head of his camera. Then he turned and pointed. "Ferretti, you take point. First team, move." Swinging his rifle up to patrol position, Ferretti stepped through the threshold into the dark corridor, followed by Brown and another soldier. "Kowalski, you and Freeman cover the rear. Riley, you and me. Let's go." They, too, bolted into the hallway. Kowalski looked around like he'd lost something. With a muted growl, he said, "Jackson, let's go." Daniel snapped away from his investigation of the wall and trotted through the doorway. After a few yards, the hallway widened into a larger area that resembled the apse of a cathedral. By that time, Daniel had caught up to Freeman. Noticing something, he reached out and grabbed the nose of the camera, directing its light down to the floor. He and Freeman were standing at the edge of a circle 12 feet in diameter. It appeared to be a metallic disc, probably made of copper, that had been carefully set into the surface of the floor. Freeman looked at Daniel and shrugged. 2 steps later, Daniel had another idea and grabbed the camera once more, this time directing its light straight up. Sure enough, an identical disc was cut into the ceiling directly above the first. Daniel stood gazing at the ceiling until Freeman, annoyed and not wanting to fall behind, shook loose and moved forward. By that time, Daniel was pretty certain those opposing discs weren't made of copper. Picking their way carefully through the dark hallway, alert to any sign of danger, the team came to the grand gallery. This vast chamber was designed in a monumental architectural style and finished with polished facing stones. For some reason, it began to feel vaguely familiar to Daniel. Along the walls, towering ornamental columns rose up to support the stone roof. They were moving uphill now. The floor of the immense gallery was built at a gently rising angle. Even O'Neill was impressed with the chamber, but not enough to distract him from the task of finding an exit. The team moved up the floor of the grand gallery, dwarfed by its size. The team's flashlights revealed the dim outline of a steep ramp at the end of the grand gallery, They climbed up to yet another chamber. With no responsibility other than to look around, Daniel was doing just that. While the soldiers, armed to their teeth, were anticipating combat, Daniel felt like he'd been transported to an archaeological nirvana. At the same time, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that he knew this place. It wasn't déjà vu. He just couldn't quite put his finger on it. When Freddy was alone at the top of the steep ramp, he suddenly squatted down. The movement set off a chain reaction as each member of the team hit the deck. Before Daniel knew what had happened, Freeman had cut the light on his camera and dropped to the floor. All eyes were glued to Ferretti, who lifted up just high enough to study the contents of the next room. Without turning around, he gave the come-ahead signal. Daniel started to go until Freeman reached out and grabbed him by the ankle. "Not you, bonehead. Stay down." O'Neill sprinted silently to the base of the ramp, then crabbed up the incline to Ferretti's position. After conferring for a moment, O'Neill signaled the team to approach. Daniel checked with Freeman and got the go-ahead. By the time the team gathered on the ramp, they could see that Ferretti was already deep into the next room. It was some sort of entrance hall. There was light at the end of this room, sunlight. The hall, another large boxy room, was punctuated every few yards by huge stone pillars. The team watched Ferretti dart from one of these pillars to the next until he was in position to see where the light was coming from. He turned and gave the group a thumbs up. O'Neill responded by sending 2 more soldiers into the hallway to meet Ferretti. When he was convinced the area was secure, the rest of the squad came forward. When the team converged in the entrance hall, O'Neill conferred with Brown, who had already taken atmospheric readings. "Conditions are similar to inside. Radiation, electromagnetic, and other exposures indicate normal." O'Neill listened to the report before poking his head around the corner and studying the last hallway. Satisfied with what he saw, he turned back to the squad and pointed again to Ferretti and Brown, who immediately turned and went. Moving one pillar at a time, the team advanced toward the huge square doorway and the sharp daylight beyond. A few strides before the threshold, O'Neill lifted a hand in the air, stopping the troop's progress. Without turning back, he signaled a soldier to either side of the doorway, which was 20 feet wide. When they'd peered outside and given the all clear, O'Neill took the last steps forward and leaned out to check the area above the doorway. Then, and only then, did he lead the way out into the sun for their first look at this new world. The team came out onto a long stone pier that extended into an ocean of sand. They could barely believe their eyes as they saw nothing but lifeless brown sand dunes stretching away in every direction under an intensely blue sky. Down at the end of the stone platform, 40 yards away, stood a pair of obelisks, half buried in the loose sand. The team gazed around at this arid brown world, each man lost in his own thoughts. Except for a hot breeze, there was no movement, no sound, no indication of any life on this sandy twin of Earth. Before Daniel was outside, he had a theory about what this massive structure was going to look like. He walked into the sunlight, and while the others stood mesmerized by the barren vistas of this new world, Daniel turned and craned his neck for a view of the structure he had just exited. It wasn't what he expected. The door was only a small proportion of the structure's exterior. On either side of the door were massive stone pylons, thick walls that towered above the entrance. Into the pylon walls were built narrow slits, windows that allowed air in, and, in case of attack, could allow weapon fire to the outside. These pylons were very much in the style of those to be found at the ancient temples of Luxor and Karnak. Everything was starting to make sense. While the others were stupefied, O'Neill was on the move. "Hold and secure positions around this entrance. I want a better look at where we are." "Hold on, I'll go with you," said Daniel. O'Neill didn't respond. Daniel trailed after the 3 soldiers as they jogged down the gently sloping ramp. As the dunes grew higher around them, so did the temperature. Daniel guessed it was 90 degrees in the air, 110 on the sand. Kowalski, well over 6 feet, and Ferretti, well under it, made it to the base of the ramp first and took up defensive positions at the base of the obelisks. When Daniel approached, he saw that these marble pillars, 40 feet tall and tapering to sharp pyramidions at the top, were different from any he had seen on Earth. They were not covered with hieroglyphs. Astonished, Daniel couldn't believe that his theories were being proven right before his eyes. After examining the twin spires, Daniel ran past the soldiers and up the side of the first dune where O'Neill was already standing. Looking back, when he reached the top, he turned and looked back, hoping he would see the structure more clearly and also hoping that it would further support his hypothesis. What he saw knocked the wind out of him. It was much more than he had hoped for in his wildest dreams. Not only was the enormous structure completely Egyptian in design, but from this distance he could see the structure was merely an entrance to a much larger structure, a structure more famous than any other in human history, a pyramid. But it was a pyramid so monstrously, phenomenally large that it seemed to be hovering directly above Daniel, ready to come down and crush him. It had to be 2 or 3 times as large as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Unlike the dilapidated pyramids at Giza, this one showed no signs of decay. Its smooth-facing stones were all perfectly in place and seemed to glitter in the hot suns. Hanging up in the electric blue sky behind the pyramid were not 1, not 2, but 3 suns. Now Daniel understood why the interior of the building had seemed familiar. It was a far more advanced version of Khufu's pyramid. Perhaps this was the very same structure the ancient Egyptians had once tried to reproduce. In a moment of triumphant exhilaration, he realized that he had been right all along. He leaped to his feet and shouted to the dunes, "I knew it!" O'Neill had no idea what Daniel was talking about. He watched coldly as Daniel gyrated through an impromptu victory party in the sand, laughing, punching the air, and yelling, "I knew it!" about 25 times. Ignoring Daniel, O'Neill went on with his calculations. He decided on a plan, stood, and marched back up the ramp to deliver his orders. Chapter 11. A Little White Lie. He sat in a slice of shadow between 2 dunes, watching Science Officer Brown hammer rod after galvanically calibrated rod deep into the ground, collecting soil and mineral samples. Brown transferred the specimens into numbered glass beakers, murmuring an endless blur of facts and numbers into a tape recorder. He and Daniel were 500 yards away from the obelisks, but even at this distance the pyramid, that most primitive and mysterious of constructions, seemed to loom directly above them. Daniel had been back inside the pyramid to search for information, particularly the writing he had expected to find. The constellations cut into the spinning inner wheel of the Stargate were the only glyphs of any kind. This absence of markings had scared and confused Daniel. While he stared at Brown executing his careful procedures, he was thinking hard about what the team would have to do next. Nearby, O'Neill had found a natural stone ledge and was using a pair of binoculars to scrutinize the endless roll of pale brown dunescape. Kowalski and Porro labored up the sandy hill to the top of the bluff where O'Neill was standing. Both of the men were drenched with sweat. "Colonel, we've surveyed the quarter-mile perimeter. Nothing to report. It's just a bunch of sand." Daniel could hear them clearly. "All right, good work," O'Neill said. "Let's wrap it up and move everyone back inside. I want you people back through within the hour. I'll mark the equipment I want left behind." O'Neill looked over at Daniel and started toward him. Kowalski wasn't sure what he'd heard. He called after the colonel. "What do you mean, you people? Are you planning to stay for a while?" He was only kidding, but suddenly realized it wasn't a joke. O'Neill continued his march through the sand toward Daniel. "Sir, you're going back with us, aren't you?" There was no reply. When O'Neill reached Daniel, he stopped and shouted to his men scattered in the surrounding dunes. "Let's pack it up. It's time to head back." Head back? Daniel knew that was impossible. He didn't have enough information yet. He looked across the dunes, pretending to study the pyramid. He knew O'Neill was about to give him the order he couldn't execute. "Get ready to move. We've got to get you back inside so you can get to work on the Stargate." Kowalski, Riley, and Ferretti came in earshot just in time to hear Daniel telling O'Neill, "I need more time. We've got to scout around. There's bound to be other structures here, other signs of civilization. If I can find—" "That would be nice, Jackson, but not on this trip. What we need from you is to get back inside and reestablish contact with the Stargate on Earth." The soldiers came to the top of his dune, surrounding O'Neill, intent on understanding the plan. Daniel was in the tricky position of announcing the bad news in front of them. "You're not getting it." He let it fly. "This structure is an almost exact replica of the Khufu's pyramid." There. Now they had the whole ugly truth. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ferretti asked with a pained expression. Obviously, Daniel had overestimated the group's grasp of Egyptology. "What I'm talking about is that we're not going to find any hieroglyphs or constellation displays inside this pyramid. No writing of any kind. I've checked everywhere." "Spit it out, Jackson." Kowalski was suddenly very interested in what Daniel had to say. "Look, the coordinates were marked on big, elaborate tablets back on Earth, right?" He tried to sound encouraging. "So there must be something like that here. All we have to do is expand our search and find it." Kowalski spontaneously combusted. He jumped into Daniel's face. "Your only assignment was to spin that friggin' ring around and get us back home. Now can you do it or not?" Daniel gulped. "No, I can't." O'Neill put a restraining hand in the middle of Kowalski's chest and stepped between him and Daniel, as calm as ever. "Can't or won't?" he asked. "You told us you could do it," Kowalski roared. I assumed I would have information." "You assumed." O'Neill's disgust was plain. Then Kowalski lost it. He reached past the colonel and grabbed a fistful of Daniel's shirt, pulling him forward. "That wasn't the deal, Jackson." "Lieutenant." O'Neill's calm voice froze Kowalski, but didn't convince him to release his grip on the front of Daniel's uniform. "Oh, this is beautiful. This is very pleasant," Ferretti started yammering. "This means, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're stuck out here. Oh, that's spectacular." Kowalski was holding Daniel, forehead to sweaty forehead, his eyes beaming pure hatred. "Listen to me, you lying son of—" He lifted Daniel off the ground. "You make that thing work, or I'll break your neck." Kowalski felt himself on the verge of doing just that, so he pushed Daniel away, knocking him backward into the sand. "That's enough," O'Neill announced very evenly. "We'll establish our base camp right here. Kowalski, organize a detail to haul the supplies out here." "Establish a base camp?" Kowalski was incredulous. "The mission objective is to recon the quarter-mile perimeter, then get back through the device. What good is it going to do?" O'Neill was finished talking. "That's enough, Lieutenant. You are not in command of this mission." It seemed like the wrong way to say the wrong thing to the wrong guy at the wrong time. Kowalski took a sudden, threatening step closer to O'Neill. For an instant, everyone was certain there would be a fight. No one needed to remind Kowalski of who was in charge. It had been an extremely sore spot with him ever since O'Neill had suddenly arrived and relieved him of his command. Until this moment, he had been able to suppress his anger, burying it deep within his professionalism. But it was clear to him that the whole project had started going to hell the minute O'Neill took over. And now here they were. They were marooned in this Saharan inferno, with at best 3 days' worth of water. The success of the mission had never seemed particularly important to O'Neill, and that led Kowalski to suspect he might be prosecuting some secret agenda. Something cooked up between him and General West. He had every reason to hate O'Neill. When Kowalski stepped toward him, O'Neill made no move to defend himself, practically daring the bigger man to attack. But the next second, Kowalski did what O'Neill knew he would. He followed orders. After a tense, threatening moment, Kowalski chose the supply detail. "Freddy, Freeman, Riley, Porro, back inside." He turned at once and began slogging down the side of the dune, the first steps of the long trip back to the pyramid. O'Neill returned his attention to Daniel, looking at him for a minute before saying, "Now you've endangered everyone's life except mine. Now follow the men and help them offload the equipment and bring it back." Daniel didn't think following Kowalski into the darkness of the pyramid was the safest course of action at the moment, but it didn't seem as scary as staying out here in the desert with O'Neill, so he started down the dune after the soldiers. An hour later, the soldiers were already well into the process of establishing the base camp, pounding long tent spikes into the ground, unpacking additional communications paraphernalia, stacking the supply crates to erect a shade wall. None of the soldiers discussed the limited supply of rations and water, but everyone was thinking about it. Daniel was positive Kowalski had assigned him the heaviest single item on the cart. It was slow, hot work tugging the small crate across the rolling desert, and then up the steep side of the last dune. About halfway up, he took a break and listened to the enlisted men argue. "I don't believe this. We're stuck out here." Freddy was still having a fit. "Knock it off, Mr. Doomsayer. Quit being so negative," Freeman said. "He's right," agreed Riley, looking up from hammering the tent spike. "If we're not back soon, they'll just turn the gate on from Earth." "Look, dimwit," Freddy began to lecture Riley. "Ask yourself how you got here. Was it a 2-lane highway? No. You got blasted through this weird energy cannon at about 50 billion miles an hour, turning you into a friggin' zero-mass interstellar Gumby, okay? Now think, how many directions were you going at once? One direction. Now, not only is the silo emptier than a church on payday, but even if those science boys do go back inside, and even if they do turn that goddamn galactic garbage disposal back on, what are you gonna do? Swim against the current?" Science Officer Brown was listening. He looked up from assembling the dish scanner and said, "Freddy's right. The beam moves one direction at a time. We're in big trouble." Inside the Stargate room, O'Neill lifted the last crate off the equipment cart and walked toward the doorway. He looked down the long hallway, pitch black except for a series of flares. He didn't see anyone coming. He immediately set the box down and returned to the equipment cart. Kneeling over its floorboards, he reached into his pocket and brought out an oddly shaped tool, then bent down to work. A moment later, Kowalski's voice was in the doorway. "Sir, base camp is operational, sir." Coolly palming the tool, O'Neill eased around to face the intruder, his expression as impassive as ever. He nodded in vague approval. "I want to apologize for losing my cool out there," Kowalski began. O'Neill's hand slid into his pocket, then out again, unnoticed. "Part of it," Kowalski went on, "is that it seems like more is going on here than meets the eye." "So what?" O'Neill asked, implying that it wasn't Kowalski's job to know everything. "For instance," the soldier persevered, "what was that you said about not coming back with us? What was that all about?" "Apology accepted," O'Neill said flatly. "This crate goes to base camp." Kowalski stood his ground, waiting for a more human, more rational response. But O'Neill wouldn't budge. "You're dismissed, soldier." Furious and disgusted, but unwilling to show it, Kowalski leaned over and picked up the last crate. He made sure O'Neill saw how easily he lifted it, using his strength to send the colonel a veiled threat. "If I wanted to, I could break you open with my bare hands." When he'd made his point, Kowalski set the crate on his shoulder and walked out. The moment he was gone, O'Neill went back to work on the equipment cart. Working the oddly shaped tool into a gap between the floorboards, then giving it a strong twist, he revealed a hidden compartment. A hatch door popped open. O'Neill reached inside and brought out a pair of heavy steel cylinders. The gleaming canisters were obviously the two interlocking halves of a technologically sophisticated device. He lined up the guide marks on the thick tubes and pushed them together until they locked with a sharp click. As soon as the device was assembled, a small door, no more than 2 square inches, slid open at the end of the canister. It held a small square orange key. O'Neill took the key, then closed the panel. Very gingerly, he laid the log-sized mechanism back into the hidden compartment and locked it. He stood up, and when he was satisfied no one was watching, he forced the key into a slit cut into the waistband of his fatigues. Then he headed out to rejoin his men. Daniel pulled the trunk up the last sand hill and onto the rock shelf O'Neill had chosen as a base. Exhausted and hurting, he collapsed chest first into the sand with a huge grunt of relief. The soldiers showed how impressed they were by ignoring him completely and returning to their assigned tasks. When Daniel pushed himself up, a layer of the sand came with him. He was dripping with perspiration, and the sand clung to the moisture. Just what he needed. His uniform and face were both covered in a mask of fine grit. But that was the least of his problems. His lower back felt like the bullseye at a hatchet-tossing competition, and he could feel the first pain of sunburn rising on his neck and arms. He wondered what sunstroke felt like and whether he'd know when he had it. Then he remembered he was on another planet, and his travel allergy kicked in. He sneezed 11 times in rapid succession. He tipped the crate onto its tall side and sat in the sliver of shade it created. He started going through the supply kit he'd been issued. Toothpicks, water purification tablets, a 2-ounce Mylar blanket, a sewing kit, compass, processed fruit rolls, sunglasses, breath mints, 2 knives, signal flares, cyanide capsules, a hammock, string, tape, bandages, first aid materials, but not the thing he was looking for. I can't believe the Army. There's every useless thing inside this pack except sunblock. None of the soldiers so much as looked in his direction. Daniel tried again. Ferretti, Porro, didn't any of you guys bring any sunblock? I'm burning up out here. Jackson, we need that crate over here, Ferretti told him matter-of-factly. Daniel wiped as much sand off his face as he could, then hunkered down into his box-pulling stance. As soon as he bent over, his back felt like the proverbial poodle in the microwave, so he decided to make 2 trips. He unlatched the lid and opened the box. When he saw what he'd been schlepping across the desert, he jumped back with a shout. Jesus, you guys planning on fighting a war here? 24 semi-automatic assault rifles were strapped into the crate. Thanks to you, we've got the time to fight one, Ferretti hissed. He had just about reached the boiling point, and the sight of Daniel staring dumbly at the rifles was making him hotter still. Why don't you do something useful, Jackson, like maybe a little reading? With one hand, he whipped Daniel a 40-pound backpack in a straight line through the air. It flew straight into Daniel's chest, sending him into an ungraceful backflip off the crest of the dune. He landed 30 feet down the hill in a spectacular shower of sand and spinning books. By the time he'd sat up and spit a couple of times, his half-empty bag was rolling to a stop at the base of the slope. Obviously, getting along with the soldiers was going to take a bit of work. Ferretti walked to the edge of the dune and watched Daniel stagger to his feet. He made sure no one had been hurt before going back to his work. By the time Daniel looked up, the top of the cliff was empty. It was only him, his books, and a lot of sand in between. Reluctantly, painfully, Daniel started the long, hot walk to the bottom of the steep hill. He reached down stiffly for the last of the books, trying to grab it without bending his back. He got it, but as he was stuffing it into the sack, he suddenly let everything tumble to the ground. Something had been there. Pressed into the sand a few feet away were what appeared to be hoofprints. Daniel edged closer. The prints were so deeply indented into the arid soil that only a very heavy animal could have left them. The tracks, obviously fresh, headed off around the next dune. His first impulse was to call the others and show them what he'd found, but he was certain they'd only use the occasion to give him more grief. He looked up the slope, but the soldiers were out of sight. After a brief hesitation, he decided to see what was around that next dune. Lacing his fingers behind his back, trying to look absolutely harmless, Daniel followed the trail around one dune, and then another. The prints led him deeper and deeper into a maze of tall moguls, then to the base of a steep 20-foot wall of soft sand. It took Daniel several tries before he was able to scramble to the top and take a look around. That's when he saw it. He froze, gripped by fear, and stared at the grotesque sight before him. Less than a stone's throw away, a huge, bizarre-looking animal raised its head and studied Daniel through the blur of heat lifting off the sand. About the size of an elephant, it was a long-haired giant, a horrible hybrid of mastodon, camel, and water buffalo. Extremely top-heavy, the animal had absurdly thin legs to support its huge weight. The two mammals stood in the hot sun staring at one another blankly for a long time before the larger one turned away with a loud snort. It dropped its head back to the ground where it was rooting in the sand, probably for food. Using its meager forelegs, it began to dig. Daniel watched the powerful animal kick up big sprays of sand as it burrowed. "Where's Jackson?" Kowalski asked before he'd come to the top of the base camp hill. The entire contingent of soldiers started snickering. All eyes went to Ferretti. "Professor Jackson dropped his books over the side," Ferretti explained, pointing to the edge of the stone outcropping. The way Ferretti said it brought a bigger laugh from the men, but Kowalski wasn't amused in the least. He hurried to the edge of the bluff and looked over the side. Jackson's backpack lay at the bottom of the long incline, abandoned. Grimly serious, Kowalski turned back to Ferretti and got a straight answer out of him. The next moment, he was barking out a crisp series of commands. He put the base on alert and mustered a search party. He ordered Brown and Porro to grab rifles, canteens, and field phones. The three of them were just about to leave when O'Neill arrived. When the situation was explained to him, he repeated, almost word for word, each of Kowalski's commands, with one exception. He would join the search party instead of Porro. As Daniel watched the beast dig, something in the animal's fur glinted over and over again in the sun. The reflection was coming from the area around the animal's jaw. Daniel didn't notice it at first, because it seemed such a natural part of watching an animal graze, even an animal as weird-looking as this one. But as soon as the sight registered with him, he immediately started marching in a straight line toward the creature. Reaching into his pocket as he went, he brought out a Fifth Avenue candy bar and ripped the wrapper open with his teeth, taking a big bite. The animal quit digging when it sensed the human coming closer. It looked up, potentially menacing. Daniel hesitated long enough to question whether he was sunstroked or actually knew what he was doing. No, he was sure the metallic reflection could only mean one thing. He came close enough to see that the animal was fitted with a harness, stirrups, and a set of reins that hung down to the sand. The earthling took a deep breath. Here was an unmistakable sign that they were not alone. It meant there was intelligent life here, a species capable of making tools and domesticating other animals to help them do their work. His heart rate surged, but he continued to move forward. The closer he came, the slower Daniel felt like walking. The animal seemed much bigger than it did a minute before, 7 feet tall at the shoulder, and much uglier. At first glance, it had appeared to be a much larger cousin of Ovibos moscatus, the horned muskox native to the North American tundra. Upon closer inspection, however, the beast looked like nothing so much as an early, not completely successful experiment in crossbreeding. It could have been descended from the mammoths of the Pleistocene epoch, or the horse-like Hippotrogeny antelope, or possibly from the extinct woolly rhinoceros, or maybe all three. It had a high, humped back and long, stringy hairs that hung in dirty, matted locks. The blistered, oily skin on its face held a pair of bulging, watery eyes set on either side of its stump-like head. Pointing straight ahead, the nostrils were glistening, moist, and unusually large. It grunted toward the human, saliva dripping off its beard. It seemed to be friendly. Simultaneously disgusted and fascinated, Daniel crept forward. Even with his sore back, he didn't feel like he was in any great danger. The harness, made from some type of leather and vines, told him the animal was probably tame. And besides, it looked much too slow and awkward to give him much of a race if it came to that. A real city boy, Daniel had no idea how dangerous the situation was. He had had no experience handling livestock, and didn't know that even a withered old milking cow can kick a full-grown man to death. Like most people, Daniel wanted to believe he shared a special, sympathetic bond with all animals and babies. It was only humans over the age of 9 that found him so obnoxious. Holding the candy bar at arm's length, swallowing nervously, he crept closer. When he was within a few feet, he stopped short, and his eyes widened dramatically. There was a red X moving across the side of the animal's sweaty face. It took him a minute to realize that the X was a laser, a targeting device. He looked wildly around the desert and spotted Kowalski aiming down at him from a far-off dune. O'Neill and Brown came to the top and stood on either side of him. Daniel put his hands in the air, surrendering. "Don't shoot," he yelled to the soldiers. "This is a perfectly tame animal." The moment Daniel's arms shot into the sky, the beast began the ungraceful process of getting down on its knees. Obviously, both hands in the air was a command it had been taught by its masters. From the soldier's vantage point, it seemed that Daniel knew what he was talking about. The animal looked about as threatening as a cow on roller skates as it folded its legs under and settled down into the dirt. The red X of the sighting laser still trained on its brain pan. "Don't feed it," O'Neill warned him from the top of a high mound, spotting the Fifth Avenue. "It's wearing a harness," Daniel yelled back. "Just don't shoot." Although Kowalski had no intention of firing until the animal attacked, Daniel felt sure the shot would ring out any second. He had to prove the thing was tame before his companions butchered it. Smiling nervously, he called to them. "Just watch. No reason to worry." Extremely worried, Daniel came the last couple of steps toward the kneeling monster and held the candy bar at arm's length. Slowly, he leaned forward until 2 thick slabs of lip flesh closed heavily around his hand. Daniel closed his eyes and held on. The animal's breath was overpoweringly foul. When the powerful tongue, the size of a cave eel, slid forward across his hand, the sensation of hot spittle was too much. Daniel yanked his hand free with a yelp, but immediately turned and faked another big smile for the soldiers. By that time they were moving closer, only their helmets visible as they dipped between the first set of moguls. The creature grunted around in the sand, found the Fifth Avenue, and chewed it up, paper and all. Daniel reached out and petted his furry new friend. Although it was emitting a sharp, punishing body odor, the animal seemed sweet enough in disposition. "You're a good old boy, aren't you?" Daniel asked the lubricious ogre in a high, sing-song voice he used exclusively for friendly animals. Patting and scratching the brute's filthy fur, Daniel examined the reins and saddle that were made of animal skin and a poorly refined iron. Whoever made them had better skill than equipment. "Who do you belong to, mister?" Daniel asked, reaching under the animal's fleshy, wet ear to give him a nice scratching. It was the wrong place to touch. Faster than a scared rabbit, this tow truck on legs stumbled up and broke into a headlong sprint. Daniel had just enough time to get out of the way, but unfortunately he stepped directly into a loop in the reins. Half a second later, the slack in the reins disappeared, snagging Daniel's foot and yanking him violently into motion. The next thing he knew, he was sand surfing at breakneck speed across the uneven desert floor, being towed along by this yak from hell. Kowalski took aim, but it was too late. The beast was darting between 4-foot dunes, bouncing Daniel around like a tin can tied to the bumper of a car. The soldiers gave chase, but the beast's incredible speed quickly increased the distance between them. Daniel was being pulled ankle first, at 45 miles per hour, across an endless skin-scratching washboard. Bumping and twisting, he glanced off the side of one dune, only to crash with a spectacular spray of sand onto the face of the next. When the terrain flattened out, and his trouser filled like a balloon full of heavy sand, he was able to control the ride somewhat by holding both hands out to the sides. He looked like a human catamaran. Despite the constant gale of sand kicked into his face by the pumping hooves, Daniel sat up and tried to reach for his snagged boot. He almost had it when the medallion Catherine had given him bounced up and shot out of his shirt. They were headed straight for a giant wall of sand. At the last second, the animal jagged away, but not soon enough for his passenger, who rode to the top of the natural ramp, then went airborne just as the medallion bounced past his nose and over his head. He tried a desperate backward lunge just as the slack in the reins ran out, yanking him violently in a new direction. He scraped across the hot ground, face first, his nose scooping up a fistful of sand. Eventually, the beast trotted to a stop. Daniel, his sand-stuffed uniform making him look like a circus fat man, was sneezing like a kitten who'd just inhaled a pepper shaker. Miraculously, nothing seemed to be broken. He looked at his hand and discovered he'd snagged the chain with one finger. Painfully, he rolled over, sat up, unstrapped his boot, and started getting the sand out of his mouth, eyes, ears, and nose. Soon he could see O'Neill, Brown, and Kowalski coming past the last dune, jogging toward him with their rifles sighted on the animal. As the team came closer, the beast turned around and started licking Daniel in the face. "Get your stinking breath away from me," he screamed, trying to slap the repulsive face away. The beast ignored him, continuing to nuzzle and lick. O'Neill got there first. "Colonel, get this thing off me!" Strangely, O'Neill lowered his gun and walked right past Daniel to the lip of the nearby ledge. Brown and Kowalski did the same thing. Seeing that he would get no help from his supposed teammates, Daniel pushed the nauseating animal away and came to see what the soldiers were gawking at. "What's so interesting?" he asked, coming up the slope. They were looking down into a deep ravine that ended in a spectacular set of white cliffs. Crawling by the thousands across the faces of the cliffs, marching in lines across the valley's flat bottom, and climbing up a series of gigantic ladders, were thousands upon thousands of human beings.